Hey, good morning, everyone. Whether you're here in person or virtually online, we try to start right online to respect everybody's schedules around the world, wherever you may be. So welcome to Black Hat Asia, Singapore. This is the country where we tried our very first black hat outside of the United States almost 25 years ago, 24 years ago. So it's always fantastic to be back where you started. As I mentioned, this is the 25th year of Black Hat, so we have a lot of special things planned. And before we get going with our keynote today, I want to tell you some housekeeping notes and remind some people of projects that we do at Black Hat, like trying to renew and trying to bring in the younger generation, trying to bring people into Black Hat, into our community that aren't maybe well established in business or don't have the financial resources to attend. To try to compensate for that, we have a scholarship program where people can submit white papers and do some unique research and send it in to us. And if it passes our review, you get a scholarship to attend. And so for Black Hat Singapore, we awarded 75 scholarships. So if you're in the audience or if you received a scholarship, please raise your hand. Anybody here get a scholarship? If so, no, I don't see anybody yet. If you do find or if you do talk to someone and they are here on a scholarship, please congratulate them and get to know them, because these will be the next generation of a lot of people entering our industry. Also, even though this conference came together very rapidly in person, it was originally planned to be a purely virtual event. Now we're hybrid, and we have attendees from 158 countries around the world. Some are virtual, a lot are physical. So it's truly a global interest. What's happening in information security is completely global. In the early days, we might have 20 countries, 30 countries, and every year it's increased and increased, and now it's at such a level that it's just safe to say that basically the whole planet is always in attendance at a Black Hat. And that's because people are desperate to try to understand what is going on. And in this environment right now, the geopolitical environment, a lot of people are desperate to figure out what's going on. So the program is today we have a keynote that's a virtual. Tomorrow we have a keynote that's in person. We have the lock note, and tomorrow's session with Chris Inglis is also live here. And so I'll say a couple of remarks now, and then we'll get into the keynote with Samir Saran. So if you've attended Black Hat Singapore in the past, or if you watched the videos that we make available online, you'll notice that I've commented before about how I think there's three groups, three teams that are forming on the internet. And this has been forming for a number of years. Right? There's Team Rule of Law. There's not official terms, I'm just making this up. Team Rule of Law. And these are sort of like-minded countries, mostly democracies, that view the world sort of the same way. They might have different laws, they might have different ways of approaching parliament or direct democracy, but they generally are Team Rule of Law. You've got Team Authoritarian, which has been gaining some steam. Team Rule of Law has very messy public discourse. Team Authoritarian has very clean internal discourse because it's usually heavily censored. So the problems that Team Authoritarian cares about is control of information. And when you talk to Team Authoritarian and they're talking about information warfare, they're talking about cyber security, a lot of what they're talking about is control of internal communications, control of internal conversation. And then in the middle, you've got Team Undecided. And Team Undecided might very logically not want to have to pick a side. But Team Rule of Law, Team Authoritarians trying to pull and push them to make a decision, trying to get them to commit. What side are you on? You know, are you with us? Are you not? Are you in between? What's going on? And this is accelerated with the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And it's accelerated for a number of reasons. One, governments just want to know, are you going to try to avoid and evade their sanctions, or are you going to help them with their sanctions? How much time do we have to think about what you're doing? But the other interesting thing that's happening now is, in the past, my thinking was mostly around governments. Now I'm adapting it. Now I'm thinking about companies. Now I'm thinking about what do they call, super empowered individuals. I'll give you some examples. So MongoDB, does anybody in the audience use the MongoDB open source database framework? Okay, so if you're using MongoDB, they, as an open source project, as a civil society, private entity, decided that they weren't going to have Russian users anymore. And they deleted the database of all the users and projects in Russia. All the people in Russia that was using MongoDB woke up the next day and it was gone. That wasn't directed by a government. That was their community deciding that they were going to essentially delete Russia. Now, is that right? Is that heavy-handed? Is that an overreaction? Probably, but we're now in an age of hyper-connected and empowered individuals and open source projects that aren't answering to governments. Maybe they're answering to their community, and their community says, we're not okay with these human rights abuses. We have to do something. Do you think your company or you might be put in a situation where you have to make some choices? Right? That's the world we're now starting to live in. Your government might be in one team, but you as an individual or as a company might be on another team. This makes me really uncomfortable in the sense that I hate being sorted. Governments hate when they're the ones not doing the sorting. And you can see this in the United States, trying to get ahead of it a little bit. There was a Declaration for the Independence of the Internet. A statement, a document that was put out last month by the United States, but it was created in conjunction with 60 other countries. So here's sort of an early expression of team rule of law, getting 60 countries together saying, here are the things we believe in. And they're doing that partially to sort. They're trying to sort who else wants to join these principles. Because the more you can create your team, the more you can sort, the more efficient it becomes, the better it is to decide where we're going to put our energy, right? And holding a conference in Singapore is fascinating because Singapore, in my view, needs to really stay in team undecided. Right? It's not a big enough country. It can't easily pick sides, especially if you're squeezed between, say, the United States and China. That's a pretty tough spot to be in. But when you are in team undecided, you can be a little bit more nimble, right? You can translate between the different groups. You can maybe sort of see things and identify things that other sides don't. So I just want you to think about how what you're seeing going on in the internet is, part of it is the teams solidifying and sorting companies and individuals and governments into these buckets. And where will you be? Another sorting that happened was the legal sanctions side. So you can see this in different countries, European Union, passing sanctions on Russian companies. And then the civil companies are trying to decide, well, what does that mean to us? And Nominet, internet registry registrar, their lawyers got together, they talked to the board, and they decided that it's too risky. So they stopped registering domain names in Russia. And then how do you renew if you can't process a credit card? All those domain names of all those companies could expire. And if they expire, well, then maybe phishers or spammers can domain squat on those and then re-register email accounts and impersonate it. I mean, you can see how it's hyper complicated. But the intention starts with a good intention, and it snowballs. On the civil society front, there's a group called Sanctions.net. And the idea is, if I have on my mailing server a black hole list, or an RBL, or I use some known bad IP databases to try to block spam, or maybe if it's from my IPS, I'm trying to block connections from bot CNCs that are known bad addresses. Should I also have a black hole list for sanctioned IP addresses? I don't want to do business. I don't want connections coming from sanctioned Russian governments or military or companies. I don't want to be in violation. So does civil society have a move here to create a list for the people who want to be able to say to their customers, we don't communicate with, I don't know, war criminals? It's never been done before. Makes civil society really uncomfortable. But people want to be able to say, we're not communicating with these sanctioned companies. So Sanctions.net is an attempt to address this, where they're trying to enumerate every government agency, every net block, and allow you to block it at your BGP routing or maybe your IP filter. These initiatives are not going away. What's happening with the Russian invasion is accelerating all of this sorting. And I want to draw your attention to something I said last year at Singapore, and it was, I like to repeat that internet problems are global problems. And being a global problem, even if we sort into these different three buckets, we are still all going to have to communicate and work together. It doesn't mean that the buckets don't talk to each other. It just means there's essentially three perspectives. And the three perspectives are going to have to learn how to work with each other to solve global internet scale problems. And generally, a lot of that is happening through civil society groups, standards bodies, the IETF, ICANN, on the governmental level, ITU, maybe the OEWG, the GGE. And so I want you to also think about the strength as individuals and as a company. Most of the infrastructure is privately owned. You have the right to not talk to any network you don't want to talk to. Right? That puts you in a very strong position. But you also have to understand that civil society, us as individuals, we're going to be the ones that really enable how these three groups will interact. If the superpowered individuals go too far, they'll be regulated. Right? If the two sides are too aggressive, squeezing team undecided in the middle, that's going to create a lot of bad blood and animosity. If you're trying to sell products into Russia right now, don't be surprised if team rule of law comes after you. Technologists hate hearing about this stuff, this layer 8 and 9, politics and budget. But this is the world we're in, and we've gotten here much faster than I thought. So I just want to point out that there's a saying that goes, code is law. And I forget, I think it was Larry, Stanford University law professor said this, and I think he even wrote a book, Code is Law. And I was thinking about that. Well, in this future, with sanctions, and if code is law, who's writing the code? So it's sort of like, who's writing the law? Well, who's writing the code? And it's us. It's private companies are writing the code. Super empowered contributors to the Linux operating system project are writing the law, right? They're writing the code, they're writing the law. Governments are not doing giant commits to Git, right? It's individuals and companies. So we're essentially writing the law. That's civil society. And so while you're hearing about airplanes and governments, just think your role. You're not off the hook. You have a role to play. And you can see this in, if you're following online, Bellingcat. Bellingcat is an open source intelligence civil society project that is documenting Russian war crimes. But before that, they were documenting through open source the poisoning of a lot of Russian dissidents. They're like a private intelligence agency in the service of civil society, in service of the planet, trying to reveal what's really going on. So this wasn't a thing 5-10 years ago. We're seeing these super empowered groups, access to great satellite imagery, not a thing so much 10 years ago. And they're shedding light in parts of governments and company behavior. For example, the NSO group has gotten more attention from the Munk School, Ron Diebert's school of Citizen Lab, revealing all the evil stuff that the NSO group with spyware and Pegasus has been doing to dissidents, leaders, activists. Right? That's not governments doing that. That's not Interpol doing that. Right? That is a professor at a school in Toronto doing that. And he's changing the way that governments and the United Nations and the European Union regulate. So it's sort of a message I'm trying to bring to you is that it can be very empowering. And even if you don't think you're having a lot of impact in your day-to-day life, you could go join and help Bellingcat. You could help make real change. And my overall message then is that civil society is critical in this future. They like to say that at ICANN, the multi-stakeholder model, But if you really look at ICANN, it's somewhat beholden to the ISP constituency. But if you take all of these efforts together, the IETF and others, it's really a broad group of citizens from every country. And so that's why I'm really kind of excited to introduce Samir Saran, our keynote today. His keynote is going to be on Hacking Democracy, Will Our Society Holds? And I was lucky enough to meet Samir as a member on the Global Commission for the Stability of Cyberspace, where we served together for 3 years. And he runs one of the most influential, or if not the most influential, think tank, civil society think tank in India. And so his perspectives, coming from the largest, most populous democracy in the world, being squeezed between Russia and the United States and China, he has some really interesting insights. So he is the president of the Observer Research Foundation, or ORF, India's premier think tank. He's in New Delhi, and his research focuses on issues of global governance, climate change, energy policy, technology, media, and India's foreign policy. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with Samir's keynote, and then afterward, I'll come up and just say a couple of closing remarks. So thank you very much for being here. See you soon.
A very good morning and greetings from India. I'm delighted to be here and to share some of our work at ORF on technology, democracies, technology, and security. I'm grateful that I've been given this opportunity to present and share some of our thoughts that colleagues of mine and I have been engaged with in the past year and hope to continue to pursue in the days ahead. The theme for today, hacking democracy, in context of our digital societies, our technology-led growth frameworks, and indeed our highly digitized worlds is important. What is at stake is the future of our collaborations, the future of our coexistence, and indeed the shape, functions, and forms of our social settlements, arrangements, constitutions, and indeed nations. One way of approaching this question would be to present a counterfactual. Rather than see technology as this great liberator of human expression and catalyst for pluralism and democratic thought, let us pose this as the new adversary. A new adversary to democracies, a new adversary to pluralism, a new adversary to freedom of expression and thought. And if we were to put this counterfactual as a point of investigation, perhaps we could start to examine it and its inadequacies in serving what it seeks to do, to free up, to liberate, and to strengthen human expression, innovation, creativity, and commerce. Has it been doing this? Or are the outcomes now far more patchy and require us to investigate and explore and perhaps course correct our journey with technologies, with tech companies, and with tech nations? Technology was meant to reduce the gap between the palace and the street. It was meant to be a medium that allowed voices of millions to reach those who sought to govern them, serve them, regulate them, and indeed protect them. And indeed, one could argue that voices of millions today are more accessible due to the ability of platforms and communication means, due to the proliferation of smartphones and personal devices, due to the plural linguistic frameworks that allow people from different parts of the world to participate in similar debates and conversations. And indeed, that has been clearly a net positive that has emerged out of our rapidly digitalizing societies. However, it would be fair to say that while it was seen as a force for good, which could bridge the gap between the state and the restless streets. By design, these platforms that allow for this are controlled by large enterprises and or large governments. The very nature of democracy sometimes makes this facet of our platforms dangerous and detracts from the public utility functions that they are meant to serve. Private companies or large governments today are therefore in control of the public sphere. They can create conversations, they can censor expression, and they can ensure certain ideas, certain ideologies, and certain businesses have a privilege over others. Much of the world is now beginning to wake up to this aspect of technology. The unaccountable power that boardrooms today have over the human condition, the American West Coast that is hardwiring global conversations, and of course, the rise of China tech and their determination to dominate innovation, high technology, and the global perception ecosystem. We are all having this debate today because we all know that to some degree, this reality confronts all of us, and to some degree, all of us must respond to it. For countries such as India, we are being caught between a competition. On the one hand, you have the big companies from the west coast of the United States that serve their bottom lines, that serve their business models, and that operate under the American constitutional arrangements. Sometimes these companies together are known as big tech. And we, of course, are also being lured to invest into the Chinese digital offerings, the low-cost Chinese devices, the Chinese social media platforms, the Chinese video apps, and others that are beginning to make themselves attractive all over the world. These companies I would now refer to as red tech. A country like India is being buffeted by headwinds from both big tech and from red tech. And in many ways, our democratic future in the rest of the world is being shaped by these two definitive ecosystems that are today overwhelming in their presence and unrelenting in their pursuit for eyeballs and for your and my purse, wallet, and preferences. In a paper I had recently put together with a colleague of mine, I had tried to piece together what are the threats to democracy beyond much of what I just said and much of what is common knowledge. What are the pain points? What are the issues that we must express and we must find solutions towards? The first, of course, is that all major social media platforms have the power to curate, promote, and curtail information. They can decide which citizen is heard and who is censored. They can cancel and they can promote. They have power over our minds and over our ideas like never before. This is unrivaled in corporate history. While US Steel, while big oil, while big tobacco were all dangerous and exerted immense influence on our societies, on our choices, and indeed on what we saw, what we heard, and what we read, they were brought to heel by domestic regulations by national governments. Standard Oil was splintered. Many other companies were taken to task through lawsuits and through constitutional instruments. But the transnational nature of big tech in different geographies makes it very difficult to regulate them. The transnational character of tech and the velocity of information make it a hard to regulate sector. They can damage democracy before we can have a file in place to deal with it. And this makes regulation of tech rather difficult, daunting, and indeed an imperative. Let's look at what has happened in recent times. Big tech has deplatformed political leaders. In the US, it has censored political leaders across the world. It has been taken based on internal decisions of the company. It has not necessarily sought either a global consensus or indeed any constitutional approval while making these big decisions. They have allowed the spread of disinformation about COVID-19, about vaccines. They have allowed the spread of hate speech because it is good for business. Big platforms have taken cover as a provider of public utility to protect themselves against private action or government interference, and yet they have behaved as private hosting platforms to create rules for the club that they believe are beneficial for their business models. They pick and choose between being a public utility provider and a private enterprise based on what they seek to achieve at that particular moment. National governments, of course, are beginning to respond to this. They are beginning to find ways of regulating technology companies, and from Canberra to New Delhi and the EU and European countries, all are grappling with the right format of curtailing the power of both big tech and red tech. Chinese technologies are perhaps even more dangerous. At the end of the day, private enterprises in the US can still be regulated through American arrangements, and we can perhaps hope for sense to prevail in Capitol Hill to bring to heel the powers that the Western companies enjoy. China tech is unaccountable at a different level. It is impossible for any citizen around the world to reach out and reach decision makers behind the Great Wall of China, and indeed now the Great Firewall of China. The Communist Party of Chinese monopoly over decision making and the opacity of their decision making processes makes China tech even more dangerous. It is impossible for an individual in any city of the world to reach out, lobby, and seek changes in Chinese policy. American tech, however, can still be challenged by citizens from anywhere around the world. Irrespective, both of them pose a clear and present danger to our societies and our way of life. Artificial intelligence, emerging technologies, quantum capabilities, and of course, the digitalization of all our personal information are going to make this challenge even graver. Not only can our expression and our ideas be shaped, but even our health and our right to life be infringed. The data that exists in the repositories of private sector today is a weapon in unregulated hands. They can decide if I deserve an insurance. They can decide if I need to board a plane. They can decide if I should have access to certain public services and utilities. I have not elected these private sector companies, and yet they today have influence on my life akin to what governments did in previous centuries. What is even more dangerous is the transnational character of these digital platforms and tech companies from the US, from EU, from China, from India, and elsewhere. Their ability to interfere in each other's public spheres, to game each other's political systems, to delegitimize governments, to criticize national policies, to mobilize national resistance and national cohorts against their own governments, makes democracy clumsy and messy in today's world. Again, while the Chinese have the Great Firewall of China, and we are unable to participate in their public conversations, they are able to implicate ours. Their handles on Twitter, their avatars on different digital platforms participate in others' conversations. There is no reciprocity. The Chinese participate in Indian affairs, in the affairs of the United States, in the affairs of the European Union. They are able to create trends. They are able to create hashtags that challenge some of the national consensus. They are able to be critical, and sometimes they are also able to inject falsehood and lies. But since we are unable to do that in their ecosystems, it's an unlevel playing field. International interference in public spheres of national societies, localities, communities is dangerous, and sometimes we overlook it to our own detriment. According to Freedom House, China has used its technological capabilities in tandem with its economic and political power to launch massive influence operations that is gaming democracies from the inside out. From the question of Taiwan, on the issue of COVID-19, on other matters of political relevance for the Chinese, they have perverted our national debates across the global landscape. But beyond the influence operations and the dangers of manipulating data that affect each individual, the biggest change that is unfolding is the compromise of our social contract with our own governments. Many of the essential elements of human existence were guaranteed by our constitutions and by our national regulations. Those who we elected in our countries, in our states, in our provinces, were responsible for delivery of these essential lifeline and perhaps even lifestyle requirements. Today, much of these lifeline and lifestyle requirements are delivered by the private sector, are delivered through digital means, and are in many sense more distant in terms of accountability and in terms of corrective action from those who they serve than ever before. Regulations are unable to rein in those who deliver to us our most important needs. In fact, enforcing regulation is nearly impossible in a polarized political system. Democracies and polarization of democracies allows and gives a free pass to tech companies. They gain these cleavages that exist today and are able to create escape mechanisms that prevent scrutiny and prevent regulations that can tame them. Democracy is turning on itself. Technology is the tool. The weaponization of technology against those who have allowed ecosystems to innovate and invest in such technologies is the single biggest challenge that we all face. If democracy has to survive, technology will have to be tamed. Technology and its role in our society faces a few headwinds, and we have to confront them and acknowledge that they are important if our digital societies are to remain democratic and plural. If democracy has to thrive in the fourth industrial revolution, we will have to confront challenges that technology has induced into our daily affairs. The first, of course, is the crisis of trust. Technology companies and technologies are generally distrusted. Those who run these companies in the private sector and countries who advance these technologies, such as China, are also deeply distrusted. And yet, because they are critical to our daily lives, to our careers and employment needs, and to our desire to remain connected with our family and friends, they are still essential and are embraced by all. This dichotomy between trust and need is creating fissures and will need sensible regulations if these need to be overcome. Trust in technology is not a euphemism. It is an imperative if our digital societies need to be protected. We need to have accountable boardrooms, perhaps even elected ones, companies that provide for many of our important needs need to be accountable to the communities they serve. Transnational corporations need to have the next level of responsibility. You cannot have selective regulations that serve the developed world but ignore the developing world. The same standards of accountability that some of the big American technology companies offer to citizens in the United States of America must also be available in Vietnam, in Bangladesh, in India, and in other geographies. And if we are unable to do this, they will be seen as a foreign agent interfering in local conversations. I worry that at some point, these tech platforms that have so deeply connected us are going to be distrusted and perhaps even prevented from operating in many geographies around the world. Trust is essential. Trust between technology companies and sovereigns, trust between technology companies and users, and of course, trust between technology companies and society. And we must distinguish between users and society. The second crisis is legitimacy. And this is very relevant to any functional democratic system. An illegitimate actor in a public sphere does not lend itself to good democracy. Many of these platforms, many of these technology companies, many of their activities, from censorship to promotion, from advertisements to canceling actors and voices, are all illegitimate in the eyes of most. You could be on either side of the political spectrum today. All of you have a grievance. All of us have a grievance with technology companies and their actions. They seem to be whimsical. They seem to be based on the choice and preference of the proprietor, owner, or the largest shareholder that manages these tech platforms. Legitimacy is crucial for democracy, and many of these are functioning at the borders of such legitimacy. Many of the big technology platforms have been designed and developed in the United States, and of course, increasingly some in China as well. The big tech companies from the West Coast seek to promote and reinforce American liberal democratic values worldwide. But outside the US, democratic values are not similar, and they change. Their application is contingent on local context, as other societies' experiences with political mobilization, social divisions, violence, and cultural diversity is different to that of the US. And in some ways, rules that may work for American society may be inadequate in other geographies. And in that sense, the legitimacy of American-style norms being applied to different nations is questionable. We have to go back to the very early years of the formation of societies, of communities, of tribes, of villages, towns, cities, and countries, and recognize that those who collected and lived together would largely subscribe to similar worldviews, similar assessments of who they were, similar assessments of what they needed, what they ate, how they dressed, their music preferences, their cultural choices, over time were similar. They gave themselves the same constitution, the same law books, and they managed their affairs through same laws. They were not like their neighboring country. They were different. They were certainly not like the United States of America. And if American law, under the guard of digital connectivity, seeks to impose itself on these societies which were clearly different and meant to be different, there is a collision of conformities. The homogenization that has been achieved through technology, or that is sought to be achieved by technology, is in direct conflict with the diversity that has been protected through millennia. We are seeing a conflict between conformity sought by technology companies and diversity celebrated through centuries. Technology will have to respect diversity. Technology does not acknowledge these cultural contexts. And this is the third challenge, that culture matters and individual choices matter even more. And finally, let me turn my attention for a few minutes to China. The Chinese Communist Party sees technology as an enabler of its control, influence, and power. It has leveraged the services of its domestic technology giants like Alibaba, SenseTime, Megvii for targeted facial recognition. It has used AI and big data and genetic testing against Uyghurs, ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, and of course those who disagree with the regime. But the Chinese use of technology is not just to control its domestic population and its local people. It is also a means of mischief abroad. Chinese see technology as a great means for election interference, for breaching the political processes, for targeting infrastructure, for targeting key installations, and for creating narratives and discussions that are inimical to free societies. There have been multiple attacks on election and associated infrastructure in Europe and in countries in the Indo-Pacific since 2018. All of these have been traced back to Chinese action. The weaponization of tech to target democracy is a clear agenda for the Communist Party of China. Besides the attack on the election infrastructure, the redesigning of the public sphere in free societies is the second most important objective. From fake news to deep fakes to a troll army, Chinese are ensuring that they are part of any conversation, any political discussion in free societies and democratic countries. In old times, in the physical town square or in a beer bar, the conversations that unfolded, that many a times shaped our politics and indeed our choices, did not have the perverse influence of outside voices. Today, the beer bars or the digital public squares or even the Google Hangouts and others continue to witness external insertions, external influence, and external ideas being made part of largely local and domestic affairs. They game the social divisions, they game grievances, they see a polarized ecosystems in the US, in India, in other democratic societies, and they widen the cleavage. Instead of reconciliation, we are seeing China Tech invest in the divisions. The business model of China Tech is to divide democracies within and outside. And this is the second objective. Mischief abroad is a business model. And finally, the China brand. We saw last year during COVID-19, and in fact, this is something that is available in many studies across the world. The Chinese brand continued to do better than any democratic nation. They were able to game the news cycle. They were able to buy media headlines in space in Western and other media systems. They were able to dominate the channels, and they were able to serve our social platforms and ensure that they were never made to be accountable for what happened in Wuhan and what we had to all endure for over 2 years. But that is not what should scare us. China's prowess and its deployment of its technology for its own purposes is indeed dangerous. But what is more worrisome is that China Tech is now very attractive to many geographies. The recent actions by technology platforms against Russia of removing Russian voices and handles and propaganda, of working together to ensure technology platforms did not have to, were not amplifying falsehoods and lies, raises a question. Can these same platforms work together and ensure Chinese propaganda is offloaded? Can they prevent amplification of Chinese lies? Can they take action against Chinese falsehoods and Chinese manipulation? Or will Chinese economic lure make these platforms incapable of taking a stand? What we need to do together is apparent. Countries need to have serious conversations on managing the unaccountable influence that tech companies possess today. Sensible national regulations need to make technology companies partner the state and not in opposition to it, to serve society and not pervert it, to protect the individual and not harm her or him. We need to rethink our regulatory design across the world in managing big tech. Second, we need to have a transnational partnership and agreement on managing transnational corporations and their implications for different geographies. We will have to find a framework that allows different assessments of human spaces, that celebrates diversity, and that understands and appreciates cultural context. One size must not fit all. One size cannot fit all. Facebook in India will have to have a very different texture than Meta in the United States. Twitter and its operations will have to be sensitized to the preferences of the Japanese, even as they have their home base in Silicon Valley. International regulations will have to use a far more empathetic and sensitive national framework as they operate in different geographies. And third, we must realize that our digital world is now a world in itself. And many of the learnings from terra firma have to be applied to our digital existence. Reciprocity has to be an ethic that we must embrace. For example, we must not allow authoritarian actors to game our public sphere if we are denied access to theirs. It is time to offload Chinese handles and Chinese propaganda from our digital world unless we are allowed to participate in theirs and challenge the writ of the Communist Party amongst the Chinese society, the Chinese digital society. If we are banned there, they must be cancelled here. Since we will not allow a Chinese government to have an embassy in our country unless we have an embassy in theirs, it is time the same ethic of reciprocity is implemented online. Democracies have an advantage. They have an advantage to be able to harness the power of the many. They have the ability to course correct, and they have the strength of devising new solutions when times are tough. We are going through a difficult decade where technology has been weaponized against democracy. We need social sciences to work with sciences. We want coders to work with politicians. We want politicians to understand technology. We need more of all, and we need to work together. Bottom lines are a useful matrix for measurement of success, but stability and resilience of nations and societies is the only lasting guarantee of prosperity. Technology now must invest in prosperity.
You can see Samir has some pretty big thoughts, and he addresses some really large problems. And that's what I like to do with keynotes at Black Hat, is to try to expose you to the bigger thoughts and the bigger pressures that you may be seeing at the periphery, but you don't ever get a chance to fully explore. The rest of Black Hat, the rest of your profession, your day job, you might be really in the trenches, challenged with some technical problem, threat hunting, rounding down a rabbit hole. But really, when I start the sessions off, I really want you to kind of start broad. Try to position yourself. Where do you fit? Where does your company fit in the global perspective? And then you narrow down and then you do your one thing that maybe you get paid to do. But that doesn't mean you should be not aware of the environment, right? Situational awareness is king. So I'm glad that Samir delivered on that. Now, before we kick off our next sessions, I've just got a couple of housekeeping notes. When you leave out the back, our next session will start in here at 10:20. Opposite this room is what we call the business hall. It's where all the supporters and vendors are demoing things. It's where coffee breaks will be. It's also where tonight there'll be at 4:30 our reception. So if you go in there and check it out, just think, I'm going to come back here at 4:30 this evening, and that's where we're going to have a reception for everybody who's attended Black Hat. It's a good chance to meet your other colleagues, kind of unwind. Also, tonight I'm doing a lock note session. So if this was the keynote, this evening is the lock. And this is an area where we get the review board members who helped select the content for Black Hat. We all get together, sit down, and have a conversation. And it's not really a panel. It's more like me asking them their opinions. And the concept is that you're in the audience watching subject matter experts have a beer, have a conversation, and you get to hear about what's interesting to them. And then about halfway through the lock note session, you get to join the conversation. You get to start asking questions, get feedback. And it just is a nice social way to end down a very technical day of conference proceedings. So that's our plan. Thank you so much for coming this morning. I'll see you tomorrow morning again for our second day keynote. It's live this time. And I'll see you around today. Thank you very much.